A warm hello from Osceola County, Florida. Although today it's somewhat overcast, but we appreciate it. We were behind on our rainfall in recent days. The rains have been coming very heavily and we've appreciated it. We hope that all is well wherever you are. We know that we do live in turbulent times in many ways, but we hope that if you are listening on the Sabbath, that your Sabbath has been a peaceful one. Recently, maybe some of you have read about Boaz, and you know what his condition was before he got married? Ruthless. Hope you like that one. I'll be talking more about Ruth and Boaz in a moment. I want to go to 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, and the 2nd verse. Here Paul, as an apostle, is providing the role of a kind of matchmaker. He is working out a union between Jesus Christ and the church. Jesus Christ as the husband, the church as the wife, and in a sense the ministry as the ones who are like the shadchan in the Jewish tradition, the arranger, the one who works on the shidduch, on the arrangement, the matchmaker. You know, in the old days there was maybe an older woman, a yenta, who would arrange the matches. And in case it was too expensive, you could rent a yenta. I'm kidding on that. But anyway, in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 2, Paul says, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ." So what he's saying is, his job is to protect this engaged woman, so she stays faithful to the future husband until he actually comes to consummate the marriage. So we see how the relationship of the church to Jesus Christ is compared to a marriage, to a bride and a groom. And we find that also in the book of Ephesians, in the 5th chapter. There's a beautiful passage on marriage, but it's interesting how it concludes. Paul talks here about marriage, and he says, verse 31 verse 31 of Ephesians 5. He's quoting from Genesis, of course, the classic passage about the origin of marriage. I got ahead of myself there. Sometimes I guess I can think faster than I can speak. But he was quoting the passage in Genesis 2 about marriage. And in verse 31, he quotes, "For this reason," and he's quoting there what Jesus Christ says in Matthew 19, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So he's talking about the relationship in marriage. But then he goes on to say in verse 32, "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." So we see here that the relationship of husband and wife is analogous, or is used as an analogy of the relationship between Christ and the church. So that means there's a lot we can learn about how we relate to God if we understand how marriages, how functional marriages ought to work. Rationally organized, appropriately biblically organized marriages, how they work, and then we can make that analogy with our relationship to God, or vice versa. We can look at our relationship to God and then apply it, in our marriages. So today I want to cover two biblical love stories. I want to talk about two biblical love stories. I want to talk about some marriages. The first one is somewhat speculative, so I'll admit that it is. And so you're getting a certain spin on some scriptures, which means you don't have to accept what I'm going to say entirely. But let's go to Acts, the 7th chapter, and verse 22. And here we have a statement about Moses. Moses was a very accomplished VIP before he did what he did, before he in effect left that behind to become dedicated to his people. But he was very important in ancient Egypt before that time. And it's in Acts 7 and verse 22, it says of Moses, "And Moses," this is Acts 7:22, "was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds." And then it leaves it at that. Well, what do we know about him, and how was he mighty in words and deeds? Well, the historian Josephus tells us that he was a general who went down into the land of Cush, the land of Ethiopia, and was quite successful there. And I would imagine if you put the account together, this was probably shortly before he had his problems back in Egypt. But when he went to Ethiopia, let's say I'll say he was around 38 years old. Josephus records that he was besieging a city there. Traditionally, that people believe that's the city of Meroe, Meroe, which was also called Saba or Seba. And there was a princess there who's called Tharbis by Josephus. He calls her Tharbis. So I call this first love story Moses and Tharbis. Now, probably a lot of you are not familiar with this, Moses and Tharbis. But anyway, we have Moses besieging the city. Tharbis sees his actions from the what do you call it, the parapet, the rampart, I guess you could call it the ramparts. There she's watching and she's seeing Moses, and she falls in love with Moses. And so she sends her most trusted messenger to him, and the situation is, if you'll agree to marry me, I'll surrender the city. That was more or less the agreement that they came to. She wanted him to marry her, and she was willing to surrender the city. Well, obviously, if you're a general, you want to save a lot of dead and wounded and heartache and all kinds of ways. That's the best solution, is to go ahead with the marriage. And so he chose to do that. So he married the princess, and he did consummate the marriage. Then he went back to Egypt. Now, it's interesting that this city was possibly this marriage. He possibly got her pregnant at that time. He possibly did. And a dynasty may have originated, which later on led to the Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon 5 centuries later. Could very well be. It's just a possibility. But anyway, he evidently went back to Egypt at that time, and now maybe the plan was he would eventually rejoin her in her country, or maybe she was going to move up to him in where he was. We don't know those details, what they were going to do. But in the meantime, his life got so messed up, he had to flee the country and go into the Sinai Peninsula. So he had to leave Egypt behind, and therefore, whatever arrangement he would have made with this princess, he would have had to leave that behind. So I suppose she went on to become queen, and I don't know what she did with her life. I suppose that could be researched. But he went on, as you know, to finally marry Zipporah when he was about, we don't know exactly how old he was when he did it, but he was about around 40. He left Egypt when he was around 40. He settled in the Sinai. He married Zipporah. Now, when he was 80, he then came back. To Egypt as a prophet of God. Now he's about 80. Now he's 80 now. And Zipporah, I don't know how old she was when they married. Maybe she waited a while. In those days, people married young. I presume the princess was probably around 16. I would imagine he was 38 and she was 16 when they married. And as I said, it was very brief. He went back to Egypt, and then his life got disrupted. He went to Sinai, and he married Zipporah. And when he came back to Egypt, he was 80 years old. Now, if Zipporah had married a little older, maybe she was 20, she would have been around 60 at that time. So he comes back to Egypt, and as you know, he leaves Egypt with the Israelites. Zipporah is with him in Exodus 18, but I don't think you find her again after Exodus 18. And so maybe she didn't live much longer after that. About a year later, we find him now in the book of Numbers, and we find that this Ethiopian princess, who would have now been around 58 or so, around that age. So he's around 81, she's around 58. So maybe it doesn't seem so shocking, because he was a rather youthful 80. He was, as you understand when you read about him, he wouldn't have looked 80 or appeared 80 if you'd met him then. And she was, as I said, she was almost 60, this princess. And if you study a map, you can see how she was located in what is today northeast Sudan. Not all that far from Ethiopia and Eritrea, where they are. But she could have gone to the Red Sea coast from where she lived, gone up the Red Sea coast, gone to Sinai Peninsula, and then rejoined him. You could look at a map and see how she could have done it. So evidently, when she was around 60 and he was around, around 81, they got back together again. And I would imagine perhaps Zipporah was dead at this time. she's not talked about anymore. But the Ethiopian woman is talked about, and that's in Numbers, the 12th chapter. So she remained faithful to him in the sense that, I don't know what she did between, the time they married and the time she got back with him. Maybe she did marry in the meantime, but maybe her husband by then had died. So she was in effect available. And she probably had heard about what Moses did. I mean, after all, that was a sensational period in history. And no doubt the people in northeast Sudan would have heard about what was going on in Egypt. It would have affected them politically. And so she knew about it. So she knew that where he was, and she went and found him. And in Numbers 12, you can read about it. Then Miriam and Aaron. By the way, if you saw the movie The Ten Commandments in 1956, there was a woman who played the part of Tharbis. That was Esther Brown, who evidently was a UCLA student at the time. But Cecil B. DeMille was very careful how he handled it. What he did was, in the beginning of the movie, you see this Ethiopian princess, and she gives Moses a gift and mentions how wonderful he is and all that, and his Egyptian girlfriend, gets jealous. And you kind of have a suggestion that there was something that was going on, but obviously DeMille didn't take it as far as Josephus did. This was 1956, and it would have complicated the movie anyway. But he did at least bring it up. As you can see if you go back to the first few minutes of that film. But anyway, now we go to, as I said, 40 plus years later. And in Numbers 12, then Miriam and Aaron spoke, by the way, as far as what she would have been like ethnically, racially, she could have been a kind of a brown-skinned North African type, or she could have had features that anthropologists would call Negro features. I wouldn't be dogmatic on that. But anyway, Exodus 12. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Now, what was the problem with that? Well, they had come to Mount Sinai. They'd made a covenant with God. They were supposed to put away idols. And here was this pagan woman coming from that background, but Moses had married her. He had that commitment to her. And for all we know, maybe she agreed to accept upon herself the covenant of Israel, as we'll see later on in the case of Ruth. We don't know that much about the account. But again, Cecil B. DeMille kind of gives us a hint here. If you again look at that old classic movie from 1956, you may remember Nina Foch playing the part of the princess who adopted Moses, who probably, no doubt, I would imagine would have been dead by then, because this was when he was 80. So I suppose the woman that adopted him might not have been alive at that time. But anyway, she's supposed to be in the movie. She's alive, and she comes on the night of the Passover, and Aaron evidently is the one who says she worships the gods of Egypt. He doesn't want her to sit at the table with them, and Moses says, yes, you must accept her, and so on. You probably have seen it. I know it's an old movie, but it's a classic a lot of people have seen. Aaron is all upset because this pagan woman is coming in, and Moses says, you must accept her, and so on. So this is maybe the situation here, that Miriam and Aaron are upset that Moses has taken this pagan to be his wife. But as I said, we don't know what her attitude was at the time. Maybe she was willing to accept upon herself the responsibilities that the Israelites had accepted. We don't know, but they were very upset anyway. But remember, he had made a commitment to her. They had been married according to what Josephus says. So they got very upset with him about it, but they were punished as a result, particularly Miriam. Evidently, Miriam was the one who was the most vociferous, and you see that she was given a disease. Moses prayed on her behalf, and she was temporarily isolated, but then healed and brought back into the camp. You can read the account in Numbers 12. So if my spin on this is correct, then I think you can see a couple of principles here. Number one, you see how she stayed faithful to Moses, that once she was available and he was to return to him, she did, and he kept his commitment to her after all those years. So it's quite an inspiring example, if indeed my spin is a correct understanding of the account. And I realize that's somewhat speculative. Well, the next one is not speculative. It's quite clear from the book of Ruth, the situation there. And I want to go to Matthew, the first chapter. There are some very interesting women who are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew 1. And All of them have very controversial backgrounds, but I want to talk about 3 of the 4 here of the women, the 3 that are named, that are given by name. I'm in Matthew, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Let me jump down to 3, verse 3. Judah begat Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So that's one woman that's mentioned there. Perez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram. Ram begat Amminadab. Amminadab begat Nachshon, and Nachshon begat Salmon, and Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. So that's another woman that's mentioned. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. That's another name that's mentioned. Obed begat Jesse, and verse 6, and Jesse begot David the king. And so this is the Messianic line. So 3 women are named here so far in the Messianic line, and all of them have controversial backgrounds. Ruth was a Moabitess, and she came from a people that were restricted in terms of their participation in the tabernacle rituals. They were not a people that the Israelites were supposed to be getting very much involved with. But yet Ruth, as we know, had accepted, had committed herself to follow the people of Israel, to follow the God of Israel and his ways. And so Ruth was, accepted into the community, and became the ancestress of King David and of Jesus Christ from a human point of view. And there are some very important lessons in the book of Ruth for Christians. And as you know, the book of Ruth is read traditionally on Pentecost, which, as you know, is the birthday of the New Testament church. But for centuries in the synagogues, the book of Ruth has been read on Pentecost. And there are some important points for Christians in the book of Ruth. First of all, we understand that God's plan of salvation is compared to a harvest. And the book of Ruth talks a lot about harvesting. Also, the Davidic line is very much the focus of the book of Ruth. The family of the Messiah, the family of David, the family of Jesus Christ is very much a focus in the book of Ruth. And a third very important point is that Ruth, as a Moabitess, coming into the covenant, the divine covenant, is symbolic of what would happen, a foreshadowing of what would happen in God's plan. The idea was that, yes, he begins his relationship with human beings through Israel, but it expands to all of humankind. And even those that have had even those nations that have maybe had let's say, a less than ideal record historically, like the Moabites, even there, it extends to the Moabites. You have later on the example of Jonah, who goes to the Assyrians. So here you have, as I said, very important points in Christianity in the book of Ruth. You have the harvesting concept, you have the Messianic line, and you have the concept of Gentiles being brought into the covenant. I want to go to the final chapter of Ruth. And I've been, because I have a New King James translation, the order of the books is not the way it is in the Hebrew order. So I finally found that it's after Judges in the New King James order. And I want to go to the final chapter of the book of Ruth. And I see that I'm not going to necessarily have time to go through even this chapter in a great deal of detail. But I think you know the account, or if not, you should read it. I recommend that you read it. If you want to give yourself an assignment, I teach, although the kind of classes I teach do not have homework. My responsibility is to teach, normally anyway, most of the year, I'm teaching immigrants to the English language, and these are immigrants, these are adults, so they're not taking it as a college class, so I'm not giving them homework assignments. I guess you could say they have an ongoing assignment to practice English, to assimilate into America. But I can give you an assignment. If you've not read the book of Ruth, then go ahead and read it. It's beautiful, and it's only 4 chapters. And I want to come to the final chapter here, and here we find that Boaz makes the commitment to do what a close relative could do in those days. A family is down and out, they sell their land, but a close relative has the option of buying it back, so it stays within the family. So, but to do that, he also has to marry the widow of the owner of that land, because that way there can be offspring, and that first child of those two would actually inherit from the deceased husband, so that way the land remains in that particular part of the branch of the family. So he's in effect giving the opportunity to his deceased relative to continue on his inheritance. by marrying his widow and then having a son who could carry on that inheritance. So it's kind of a complex system that developed based on the principle of levirate marriage that you can read about in the Pentateuch. A rather complex system had developed by that time in Judah. But I want to go to verse 9 of Ruth 4. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi." And if you want to, you can get the background on this. Naomi was Elimelech's widow. Her sons had died. They had Moabite wives, and Mahlon had been Ruth's husband. He was dead. Chilion had been Orpah's husband. He died. Orpah had gone back to Moab. By the way, there's a very famous American named Oprah, and evidently that was because the family made a mistake. I think they had intended to name her Orpah, but it came out Oprah. So I've heard that somewhere. But anyway, in verse 10, "Moreover, Ruth the Moabite is the widow of Mahlon I have acquired as my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, and that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren, and from his position at the gate." The gate is where major decisions would be made. This clan will remain a part of the civil society. They'll have their place in the order of things here in Bethlehem. "You are witnesses this day." We had the 10 men to witness. So everything is done very officially, very lawfully, very legally. And I want to cover this in terms of spiritual metaphor here, spiritual analogy. What Boaz represents is the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. This is referred to also in the book of Job, chapter 19, verse 25. I won't turn there, but you might take a look at Job 19:25, and you can study there into the principle of the Goel, the Redeemer, and that could be a messianic prophecy. It's understood by many to be a messianic prophecy. I think in the oratorio, the Messiah, I think that verse is sung as part of that oratorio. But anyway, I want to go back now here to Ruth, and we have Boaz as the Goel, as the kinsman redeemer. So in order to do this, he has to be willing to do it, and he was. There could be a way he could get out of the responsibility. It was considered, not the ideal, but he didn't have to do it. So he had to want to do it, but in order to do it, he had to be a relative of the deceased. So he had to want to do it, and he had to be a relative of the deceased. He also had to buy the land and marry the widow. Now, all of those are analogies to how Jesus Christ is our Redeemer. In order for God to redeem us, he had to become human. He had to, in effect, become related to us. In order for his plan to work out, in order for us to be spared punishment, we had to have the perfect man, sinless man, take our punishment for us. So Jesus Christ had to, in effect, become a kinsman in order to redeem us, and he did so voluntarily. So he fulfilled those requirements, and then he also had to, in effect, purchase the earth, and he did so by what he did, by the sacrifice that he made. He sacrificed himself in every way, as you know, in every conceivable way, all the punishments and torture that he endured, and finally death. And in that sense, he purchased the earth. And then finally, he marries the widow, and in this case, as I said, the church is analogous to the bride of Christ, so he marries the church, and in effect consummates the relationship, and so then he and the church, in effect, the offspring, which are the products of the work of the church. Those who come into the church as spiritual offspring, they in effect inherit the earth, as Jesus said, quoting from Psalm 37, the meek shall inherit the earth. So that's kind of a brief overview, in a sense, of the analogy here, that the Ruth and Boaz relationship is analogous to the relationship of Jesus Christ and the church. He voluntarily did what he did. He became a relative in order to do it. He sacrificed himself to do it, and then by doing so, he then marries the church. And as I said, we're looking forward to the consummation of that marriage. The return of Jesus Christ is, by analogy, the consummation of that marriage. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I want to look into verse 11. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Eternal make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." So this was a very special occasion, and it seems that people understood this to be something very special. May your house be like the house of Perez. Why do they mention that? Because Perez is the ancestor of Boaz, as I read to you from the book of Matthew. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Eternal will give you from this young woman. So just as Tamar was in a sense a controversial figure, Ruth in some ways is too, being a Moabitess. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he went into her, the Eternal gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Eternal, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel." And you can just go, you can go on and read all about that. And so they prophesied that this person would be famous, and indeed he is. And if you look at the genealogy here, his name is Obed, and in verse 18. I'm at the end of the book of Ruth now. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begat Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nachshon, and Nachshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. Now David, according to Jewish tradition, died on Pentecost. That's one reason why the book of Ruth is read at that time. You may remember in Acts 2, when Peter preached on Pentecost, he referred to David and some of his prophecies. So we have here the messianic line described at the end of the book of Ruth, and we see how in a very miraculous way it was preserved and carried forward. The circumstances there, very inspiring circumstances. So we see a wonderful love story between Boaz and Ruth, and evidently Boaz was considerably older than Ruth, much like the situation with Moses and Tarbis. If that speculation is correct. But in any case, we know from reading the book of Ruth that Boaz considered himself older and maybe less appealing to Ruth than somebody else might have been. But yet she chose him and he chose her and so on. And so we have this very wonderful love story here. And as I said, very possibly another earlier in the case of Moses and the Ethiopian. This one, of course, is more clear, not speculative. You can read it. It's very plain and very obvious, and a lot of wonderful spiritual lessons there. So I want to go now to Revelation 19. Revelation 19. So we can consider ourselves, spiritually speaking, as an engaged bride. We have to stay faithful to our fiancé. He's going to return for us and consummate the marriage, spiritually speaking. And so this has to be our status. We have to be faithful to our commitment to our fiancé as a community, collectively as the bride of Christ. We have to follow the example that we see there in the case of Ruth and Boaz. And in Revelation 19, I want to go to verse 7. Speaking about God, it says, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready." That is what is happening now in history. Historically speaking, the people of God are preparing for this ultimate wedding ceremony, as it's pictured here in Revelation 19, and we're being faithful to our fiancé in the collective sense, in the metaphoric sense. "And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clear and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So we're to be, in effect, in white clothing, symbolic of character, virtue, character. "Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true sayings of God." So I hope that these two biblical love stories have inspired us to continue on in this Christian walk, looking forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb. I thank all of you again who are who have shown an interest in this ministry. Thank you for your encouragement of this ministry. All the best to you and yours.